we're very happy today to have Dr. Pavao-Zuckerman with us. Mitch is no stranger to the department. Been with us for quite a while. Now an associate professor in our department. Works in a variety of sort of green infrastructure, urban settings, and today he's going to give us a little update on some of the work that he's been doing. Probably back in Arizona. Is that
yeah,
the
mostly
environment?
That's the semi-arid environment.
I assume that was the arid environment that we were planning to see. Anyway, glad to have you with us.
Great.
And I will manage all of the admins. You don't need to worry about those.
Okay, I'll grab this one.
You will need to remove the bar if the bar bothers you. So, thank you, Mitch.
Thanks, Marty. I'm really excited to be able to speak with you all and share some of the work that I and my lab have been doing over the last couple of years. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a large collaborative project funded by a coupled human natural systems grant by NSF. So most of the work will be things that I've done with collaborators out there. And I just wanted to sort of highlight how big this team is. We had a project of with 4 lead PIs on it and a handful of other senior personnel, faculty that worked on this as well. Each of us had a series of students and postdocs that went through our group. I'm focusing and highlighting the work of a couple of people that went through my lab, Layla, Marissa, and Tawana. But again, each of us had a collection of people working on this. So at any given time, the project may have had 30 people working on different aspects of this. I also wanted just to take one moment to point out and remember my colleague, Tom Meixner, who is actually an alumni of the Soil Conservation Program here at University of Maryland. He was tragically murdered last year by a disgruntled student while he was department chair in Arizona. Awful, awful, awful thing. And Tom's legacy lives through all of this work that we do and that a lot of other people do in urban ecosystems. In addition to all of the research partners, we had a large number of community partners that facilitated and supported this work. People from the county that the city of Tucson is located within, the city of Tucson itself, lots of different divisions and agencies within that, members of some local nonprofits, including Watershed Management Group, the Sonoran Institute, some local researchers with USDA, ARS, lots of different expertise got pulled into this. And again, funding was largely from the National Science Foundation. It was a 5-year project. I'll talk about that in a moment. But we also had support from the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy that Layla had gotten some dissertation support for. I want to also start with the land acknowledgement, and rather than just recognizing that we are on unceded territory of the Piscataway people, and this work was done in the home of the Yaqui and the O'odham people in Arizona. Those of us who work at a land grant university, it's important for us to start thinking and recognizing that the land that was granted to these universities also often came from indigenous populations, either ceded through territories or unceded. The funds from that work supports the work that I and the rest of us do now. It allows me to teach 1 less class a year, for example. So it's important for us to think about that as we do our research, our engagement, our personal philanthropy, and on and on. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a great website called thelandgrab.org. They'll tell you much more about it. All right, so on to the science. What I'm going to talk to you about today is give you a overview on sort of the perspective of cities that I and my lab group and collaborators take, telling us a little bit about how we view ecosystem services and their role in green infrastructure. I'm going to give you a little bit of context on some work that we did in Tucson, and then largely focus on the Coupled Human Natural Systems project, which views green infrastructure as a social ecological system, which you've heard a little bit about already, from other faculty in the department. I'll talk to you about our view on that. And I'll give you some information and data and findings on some of the ecological responses that we had from this project, and also work that we've done with respect to stakeholder engagement. And my goals through the study and the talk today are to highlight for you that green infrastructure effectively creates a hotspot for us to understand ecosystem services, to think about how they give us linkages within a social ecological system, and also show for you that engagement with stakeholders is one way for us to think about how we can evolve policy and evolve governance to bring more practice into urban spaces, if that's one of the goals that we have. All right, so when we think about green infrastructure, recently, just yesterday, actually, the 5th National Climate Assessment came out. And a large part of what the climate assessment is going to tell us is about the futures that we have with respect to climate change, but also ways that we can think about where we are with respect to adapting to that change. And green infrastructure is one of the strong ways that we think we can adapt, especially urban spaces, to the effects of climate change, be it changes in precipitation or connections between vegetated cover and changes in temperature and heat waves that we might have in cities, for example. So there's been a whole suite of studies and literature that have come out that have suggested that green infrastructure, or things like nature-based approaches or solutions, which is how they talk about green infrastructure in the European Union, can provide benefits to us, ecosystem services, that may help us adapt our spaces to these changes that we might see by buffering the extremes that we might get along the way. Now, there's this promise of green infrastructure, but there's also challenges to sort of putting that into practice. People call this mainstreaming, or getting it to be part of sort of the ordinary way that we go about doing urban design and urban planning. A lot of these challenges also relate to how we assess or monitor whether these systems are actually doing what we're looking for. And the suites of things that we think about when we think about challenges for implementation or challenges for monitoring aren't just, does a green infrastructure feature infiltrate water? Does it do this physical thing we've designed it for? But there's also a whole suite of social and economic factors that govern whether these things will work or take place in an urban environment. It's economic, it's social, it's policy, it's cultural. All of these different aspects have to be thought about together. And that's where we can start to get into what works in an urban system or not. So cities are notorious for messing up the environments that they sort of grow into. They create a whole set of challenges for implementing green infrastructure or doing any kind of ecological restoration that include impairing soil quality by blading soil, topsoil out, or by driving machines over that soil over and over again to compact it. We have climatic changes through the urban heat island effect, where we build up surfaces that absorb heat throughout the day, radiate it back at night, and make things a lot hotter than they would be otherwise. We have a whole suite of hydrologic changes. Because of this impervious surface, water has less spaces to go into the ground and infiltrate, so it runs through the surface and causes lots of problems, like modifying streams, like changing water quality, like affecting the ecology of water bodies, both locally and regionally. When we try to understand these ecological impacts, there's a suite of different ways that we can approach this. We can start using a set of paradigms that tell us that we can work on ecology in cities, ecology of cities, or ecology for cities. The idea of ecology in and of cities is that we basically take the concepts that we have as ecologists and just treat the city as another kind of habitat to study biodiversity, for example, or another kind of ecosystem to study carbon or water fluxes. But we can bring those together and work with that urban landscape and think about how we can use ecology for that city. How can we use ecological understanding or knowledge of both the structures and functions that we have to give us different environmental outcomes for the people and the non-human organisms that live there. Another framework that we bring into this kind of research is a social ecological systems framework. Because the problems that we're working on in cities are not just problems or challenges of the physical environment, they also involve challenges of how we fund things, how people desire or don't desire different kinds of features in their neighborhoods, both from NIMBY, but also what they might want it preferentially in spaces. We have to think not just about the ecological things, the structures, the forests, the plants, the functions that they might have, but also the systems of social interactions and governance and policy that put things into place. So this is an example of a framework from Elinor Ostrom, who is a Nobel Prize winner for her work in commons theory, but she also developed this whole set of ecological social interactions that tell us we can study the systems and structures of both social and ecological spaces, the users or the units of ecology that we might have there, and think about how they interact back and forth with each other to give us different kinds of outputs, different kinds of outcomes that we might have. So rather than studying things purely as an ecologist to understand what the environmental impacts or benefits might be, or studying things just as a social scientist, just as a geographer, an anthropologist, or a policy specialist, we have to look at things from both directions. And that's what a lot of this work that I'm going to talk about to you comes from. We use ecosystem services as a link between the structure and function of these ecosystems. If you're not familiar with this concept, the ecosystem service idea is just that nature gives us benefits. We can categorize them based upon what type of benefits we get. We get provisioning services like the food and fiber we get from ecosystems, everything to regulating services like the provision of shade and cooling by plants in an environment, cultural services, spaces for recreation, or spiritual engagement. All of these things come from that interaction of structure and function. And we think, and we designed our project in a way of thinking about how these ecosystem services actually form a bridge between the ecological and the social in these systems. So this is a modification of a cascade kind of framework that's common in the ecosystem services literature, that you would have an ecological structure or a system that gives you benefits that people might have a demand for, that demand then translates into differences in management and policy and governance, feeds back to give you a different set of ecological structures. And in our study, we assumed and thought that green infrastructure would be that change in ecological structure, that you would have desire for benefits that would cause people or maybe engage people in having more of that green infrastructure in the system and have a feedback through. All right, so that's a look at a whole bunch of different frameworks that we try to integrate together into this one study, focused on the city of Tucson and some of the municipal areas around it. This is in southern Arizona. It's a semi-arid environment. It's a desert system that doesn't get very much rain annually, has a pretty wide variety of environments in the city itself, everything from sort of native-ish xeric systems to neighborhoods that have turf grass. Some neighborhoods are designed to look like the city of Cleveland in 1960, because that's when people moved there and they brought that environment with them and their idea of what that environment should look like. Lots of different spaces people live in. We have also a population of about 1 to 1.5 million people in the city and county and surrounding areas together. So because it's in a desert system, we have a challenge with water availability. And if you've been paying attention to news out west, the last year, there's been a lot of challenges with respect to how much water is available from the Colorado River, which is where most of that water comes from. These graphs are showing you increases in population, increase in the county and the city, and also the Tucson water supply service area. And this is a graph of sort of expected ability to grow water availability to meet that demand as more and more people move into that area. You can see that most of that water comes from potable drinking water, and it levels off. At a certain point, we're not able to get more and more of that water to meet that demand. The city is trying to look at reclaimed water from different sources as a way of meeting that gap. And this water resource story is what drives a lot of the thinking about green infrastructure in the Southwest. Where can we meet that gap using this technology? I'll skip that because we already know about that. So one of the real challenges in this city is that 50%, maybe 60% of the water that is used from the tap is used for irrigation. And that's regardless of whether you have a lawn or whether you have a xeriscaped landscape, whether you have desert plants, whether you have a lot of pea gravel. That was the house that I lived in when I lived there. People water because we think we have to take care of our environment. And there's been studies that have shown people will water the same whether those plants need it or don't. So we have this growth in population, this expected expansion of the city on top of what's already there. We need to find a way to meet that demand for water. That's part of the challenge. At the same time, the water that does come in is in infrequent, high-intensity storms, usually concentrated in the summer. We get these big convective monsoon storm cells that come up from the south that dump a lot of water at any given time in very localized spaces. Because the water comes in so infrequently, the cities are designed differently there than they are here. They don't have a networked system of storm drains. They use the roads as collection devices to channel water to spaces where then it goes into a drain and then runs out into the local washes. That often gives us problems with urban flooding. So this is another place where we think green infrastructure can give us some benefit. If we're able to take water off of those streets, maybe we can reduce the risk of flooding. And those of us who spend time thinking about the interaction between ecology and water, we start to see that this way that we manage stormwater in the Southwest disconnects systems eco-hydrologically. We run water through the street when we could potentially run that water back into yards and maybe harvest that water. And some of the modeling that we've done suggests that actually the amount of water that runs through a neighborhood or falls on a house is a lot of water when you scale that water up. We could potentially meet that potable water demand for at least landscaping if we capture this water and think about it as a resource rather than a waste. And some people have started doing that. So this is how I got into green infrastructure in Tucson, interacting with the homeowner here, Brad Lancaster, who read a bunch of books on permaculture in the 90s and thought about how do I change my urban space from that to something that's more desirable? How do I bring nature into the space? How do I bring biodiversity in the space? And he saw the way to do that was to harvest water. By putting basins and berms in his yard, by illegally cutting the curb so water would flow from the street into his yard, he was able to change it from that to that in a span of 15, 20 years. There's more to the story of Brad, and I'll talk about that later on as we talk about how this idea spreads. But obviously, if you're walking through this and you get shaded as you're walking on the streets, neighbors start to see this and say, oh, that's kind of a cool idea. Or your local ward representative says, hey, that's a cool idea. Or they say, oh, they're doing that in that ward. How do we do that in our ward? How does this novel innovation of technology spread throughout the urban system? That's part of what we're interested in. The study that we've done is built off of principles of co-production of knowledge. So I have questions that interest me as an ecosystem ecologist, as an eco-hydrologist. They overlap to some degree with the people who manage that system, who are trying to reduce flooding, who are trying to grow more green cover in the city, who are trying to reduce urban heat islands for the residents there. So we find a place where our questions intersect, and we let that guide the research that we're doing. A lot of our questions with green infrastructure link to what can be done. How does green infrastructure work? If we take an idea that might come from a more mesic environment and drop it into an arid system, how does the green infrastructure function? Does it give us the benefits that we want to change runoff, to harvest water, to grow plants? Could we observe that? What scale can we observe that at? We also want to know what's actually done. There's a promise of this stuff, but what will people actually do? What do people actually put into their neighborhoods? What will the city or the county actually support financially to make this happen? How are they going to change levers of policy to make this happen? And that's what guided our coupled human natural systems project, which is this 5-year research project that has these different elements. If you've seen talks on coupled human natural systems work before, you know that they all have the same components. You have to study something about a natural system, you have to study something about a social system, and you have to study and ask questions about how they reciprocally influence each other. So for us, the questions are, how does green infrastructure provide emergent ecosystem services? And how does the human system influence policy decisions that feed back to give us more green infrastructure? So what are the policy networks? How do people learn about green infrastructure? What are the different kinds of design that we could have that would give us different amounts of water harvesting, for example, or different changes to the nutrient or carbon cycles that we're interested in studying? We're basically able to take advantage of the city, which has sort of built itself up as a laboratory, to do this kind of research. Every dot that you see there is a place, or a lot or a street that has some rainwater harvesting feature on it, be it that kind of green infrastructure berms or a cistern off a house to capture water off the roof. We can go through that network of spaces and measure a whole suite of physical variables to describe the ecological system. Everything from water quality, we can look at vegetation in space, we can look at soil characteristics, we can look at infiltration, we can look at how it retains nutrients or doesn't, on and on and on. And what I'll do is I'll just highlight a couple of things that my lab group had worked on this question, kind of coming at it from a question of soil quality and soil ecology. One of the questions we had were, how does design choice for green infrastructure influence the soils that we have in those particular systems? So because it's a water limited system, we're very interested in top dressing that soil to keep the moisture from evaporating out. Some spaces are designed with rocks to do that as mulch. Some spaces are designed with compost to do that. And that really reflects differences in beliefs and thoughts about that sort of permaculture idea. How do you feed that soil to do different things? So we've gone out, taken a bunch of different samples from different features that have different kinds of mulches on them. We compare that to even some native soils in the cities. And one of the things we used were nematode community analysis in the soils to tell us something about the health and status. A lot of research has gone into making this sort of background figure, a whole set of studies from agricultural settings, forest restoration projects, to say, if the community, based upon which organisms are there, fits into these boxes, it's either very well structured or degraded or disturbed or on its way to maturing, based upon whether the food web has a lot of structure that's vertical structure. Do we have a lot of predators or omnivores or not? Or how well do things respond to enrichment? Flashy inputs of resources, do we have organisms that are good at handling that or not? If you were going to take a guess to where an urban soil is going to land in this matrix, where do you think it's going to go? Degraded. If you've taken an ecology class with me, you know the answer is, well, it depends. That's always the answer in ecology. This is what a yard looks like. Not green infrastructure feature, just someone's yard with rocks, pea gravel, not a whole lot of plants around it. not a lot of food web structure. But when we put these basins out and harvest water, bring resources into a space, we get a great increase in food web structure. We start to see an increase in omnivores, an increase in predatory nematodes, shifts in fungal to bacteria ratios, all these things that are indicative of healthier soils from the perspective of that soil food web community. We get differences though if we're using rock versus organic mulch. The organic mulch feeds enough carbon into that soil to give these extra benefits of what we think is soil health. This translates to differences in nitrogen processing, for example. And we found when we did incubations in the lab and in the field that the sites that had the organic mulch had slower rates of nitrogen production, meaning in theory, they're feeding less nitrogen into the system to bleed out and perhaps affect water quality downstream from these sites. Right, so we've done work that shows that this green infrastructure design can affect soil quality. We've also done work to look at what green infrastructure does to the vegetative cover. So we've gone out and surveyed the size of trees that are planted along streets that are next to a basin versus those that are not getting water fed in by the basin. The trees that are getting water from the basin are larger by 33%. So that influx of water gives them that much more ability to photosynthesize and grow. And one of the things that we also measured was how active plants were over the course of the day. We think this is what's driving that difference. The added water lets the plants be more active longer into the day. Whereas plants that are not getting that extra water, they shut their stomata and they're not photosynthesizing as much. That small difference on each leaf translates into a big change on each tree. Some of the students on the project have done some work with remote sensing and looking at neighborhoods that have a lot of green infrastructure that don't actually see a greenness signature that's different in satellite images. So we can measure what's going on differently at the tree level and show that we see increases in crown diameter and diameter of breast height. These studies also show us that we see increases in canopy cover just by harvesting water off the system. So we're able to turn that waste into a resource. Right, we have a whole lot of other studies on the natural side of this that I'm not going to talk about. I just wanted to show you the potential for green infrastructure to improve soil quality and improve that water kind of environment. And what I now want to focus on are some of the social system research questions that we worked on. So in the social science approach, we're using a whole set of methods to get at different parts of that system, to understand the networks that people that work in green infrastructure learn through. We're asking questions to try to understand how individuals learn, but also how the social system itself learns about change and learns about things that can happen on the ground. We try to understand what influences how green infrastructure gets adopted by local governments, by local participants, by using surveys, by using case studies, and by doing things that we call science policy dialogues, basically bringing people together in a workshop to talk about these different factors. These are ways that we characterize both the social system, but also the ways that we think that there's an interaction back and forth between parts. One of the things that we found was that policies evolve through time in this particular system, and it evolves through the influence of diverse sets of actors and people that we call policy entrepreneurs. So this is showing you a timeline of different sort of green infrastructure events through the city. This is where Brad starts to do his illegal curb cuts in the early 2000s. And over time, the city recognizes that this is a way to harvest water. So then it goes from being this sort of underground guerrilla activity to an activity where now there's a permitting process. You can apply to the city and say, I want to cut my curb. How do I do that? The city has now come up with ways to do that in a way that's safer. So rather than going with a saw and cutting out chunks of that have become a tripping hazard or hazards for people with disabilities, They just go through and they bore through it and just drill a hole through the curb. Much safer. But the city is now on board with this and doing that as part of their policy. They've also added regulations where now they require new development to do this kind of harvesting. So it's not just something that people want to do. Now the city is imposing this on residents. We also see that there's a shift in how they fund this over time, an increase in the use of rebate programs to try to spread this from neighborhoods that have lots of resources to neighborhoods that may not have those kinds of resources. So we can learn a lot about how this policy evolves by studying who's engaged with it and what changes happen over time. That's one way that we can learn about sort of the structure of that policy environment. We have also done a set of surveys with stakeholders to try to understand what sort of environmental factors they think are most important as challenges in that city and how green infrastructure may meet those challenges. So trying to get a sense of what they know about ecosystem services, what they demand from systems, and what they think those systems can provide back in. So we set out a set of surveys to people that are sort of key actors in this water harvesting environment at the city and county level, people that work with environmental utilities, people that work with design firms, neighborhood association representatives, to try to understand what they think those challenges are, and again, what services they might get from it. We also asked them to do this for different types of features that are related to water harvesting. So green infrastructure basins themselves, urban forest canopy, and rooftop cisterns that can harvest water when rainfall comes in. And then they can save that water for other uses. This is just one of the sets of results that we get from this set of surveys that came out of Leila Mosla's dissertation. This is showing you the ecosystem services that these experts think can be supplied by these different features. So the cistern is shown in orange, the urban trees are in green, and the rain gardens are shown in blue. And there's a whole set of different things that we think these different features can do, and where they fit on that radar diagram tells you how strong they think these different features are at providing those services. So the cisterns, for example, are limited in what they might be able to provide. They aren't as strong at giving aesthetic services or enhancing biodiversity per se on their own, where urban trees are really good at doing a lot of things really well. So we see that the people that are managing the system recognize that these features have multifunctionality. They do more than just capture water. They do a lot of stuff with that water. They do it to different degrees. But we can also look at what they demand from these things. What do they want it to do based upon what they think are important environmental challenges? They're really interested in modifying urban heat islands. They're really interested in reducing stormwater runoff and giving us water that can then be used for later to try to meet that potable water demand. They're less interested in these features dealing with air quality or enhancing property values, all things that they can do. But we see that there's places where there's a connection and a disconnection between what people want and what people think the system can give them. This lets us then go in and think about where those trade-offs come in and how people prioritize, whether they're going to put a system in or not, whether they're going to use a cistern versus a tree canopy expansion program relative to a rain garden, for example. We can look at that diversity. We also have worked with more engaged approaches than surveys to try to get a sense of what different stakeholders are interested in getting out of these systems. So we use what we call a science policy dialogue approach, where we bring together these stakeholders with researchers to show them what we've been learning based upon the questions that they tell us are interesting. And then we use that new knowledge to see how does that shift what they think the system could do for them? How does that shift some of their perception? Does that change what their goals might be? And what we did in this particular example was try to characterize the knowledge systems that these different stakeholder groups had with respect to water harvesting and green infrastructure. We brought them together, told them a little bit about what we had been learning, and then asked them, what do you think are the barriers to getting more green infrastructure and water harvesting into the city? And then broke them up by sector. So we had people from the city work together, people from the county work together, people from design firms work together, people from neighborhood associations work together. And then make us mental maps of all of the components and how they interact together from that urban hydrologic system to give us the outcomes that we're looking for. We basically said, going in, tell us what's going to increase the amount of harvested water. Think about the things that can increase that, think about the things that might decrease that, and then start drawing connections between them. I introduced them to this idea of what we're building is a fuzzy cognitive map. It's a mental map of what these people think is driving parts of the system. This is another example from the literature of photovoltaic system adoption. But again, you have a central node that you're trying to see what's the levers that's going to increase or decrease the use of this new technology. You get people together to draw you connections back and forth. They can tell you if that arrow is going to make the thing increase or decrease. And they can also weight those arrows on a scale of -1 to 1. So something that's going to have a really strong effect would be rated 1. Something that's a very weak effect would be closer to 0. This allows us to do lots of different things, build scenarios out. It allows us to think about sort of a systems dynamic here. We can apply even some like food web network typology kind of indices to this. And this is what some of the maps look like. I had people do this on Post-its and then digitize it in a software called Mental Modeler, which allows us to pull indices out. But you can see that there's a really different set of networks that we get from different stakeholders. The neighborhood associations did not have a lot of interaction between the factors that they thought were influencing water harvesting, for example. We see that the nonprofit representatives that we invited didn't see a lot of red lines in their model, which means they don't see a lot of things that have like negative feedbacks. Everything's positive feedbacks for the most part for them, when you qualitatively just see that from where you're sitting. There's a bit more of a mix when we look at the city managers, which is really interesting. What we see is that these maps actually represent the knowledge systems that people have. Part of what I do is essentialize this down into some things that we can think about. A lot of metrics we can calculate about structure. The only thing I'm going to talk about just very briefly is this complexity idea. We can summarize how many links go in and out of every box that they put into their models, and that tells us something about how complex they think that system is. The neighborhood associations that didn't have a lot of that sort of spaghettiness have a very low complexity score. The city managers have a high complexity score. Maybe this reflects their training. Maybe this reflects their experience working in the city. We also use sort of a form of content analysis to try to categorize these different factors that they built into their knowledge systems and representations. And we can see that they've been into ideas of either policy to promote, design aspects like having training or maintenance costs built into things, external factors that will affect water harvesting like drought or climate change, and public awareness and education. And again, differences between different groups. The city and county representatives saw a lot of importance in their model of design elements, things that can make things work more efficiently, and education and outreach. Whereas people that came from the neighborhood association and designers, for example, they had representation of ideas coming from policy. They wanted policy levers to give us more water harvesting. So from this, we see that there's overlapping interest. We know that people want to have ecosystem services, this multifunctionality that can come out of these rainwater harvesting features, this green infrastructure. But there's a divergence on what they think the barriers are. There's a divergence on how they think we can get there. These science policy dialogues show us then, all of this work together shows us there's an intersecting set of these barriers and goals, and that the knowledge systems that people have are really important for telling us about opportunities for conflict and opportunities for collaboration in this system. It's also a means for us to do knowledge co-production, because again, we can meet with them in successive iterations and take what we learn at one point, ask new questions, have new findings, and drive the policy evolution in this particular city. So in a sense, the natural system and the ecological, the social system engage and inform each other through that iteration, through that sort of design that NSF has for this funding mechanism. It actually comes from the idea that that's how things work in practice. And our work is starting to show that. We're starting to show that green infrastructure builds these hotspots in the ecosystem, not just places where the ecology is more active, where we get the building of soil health, or places where plants grow, but places where people come together to work on things, places where policy innovation happens, places where education starts to happen. So what do we do with this work once we have these kind of dialogues and study the system? We don't just treat people as sort of research subjects. We engage with them again in this co-production idea. We share our findings with them so that they can learn about what their collaborators and colleagues think about that system. So we build reports like this that help them see sort of the bigger picture of what everyone is looking at. I'm not going to walk you through what this looks like, but this is a policy preference exercise that we did at a successive workshop. So we're able to get a sense now, you've told us what you think is important. Now let's link it to specific policies that are done in other cities to get green infrastructure in the ground. Based upon what you think is important, this is what you think will now work. We can use our skills as academics to build that iteration. I'm going to be on sabbatical in Tucson in the spring. I'm going to continue this kind of work, focusing partly on neighborhoods in South Tucson, where we're engaging with communities that are low income, primarily Hispanic, to try to help them build their plant cover using green infrastructure, using some of these same approaches. All right, so I hope I've shown you that we can couple these ecosystem services and decision-making processes in cities to make effective use of green infrastructure. And it's this iterative engagement between science and policy that gives us this pathway to adoption, pathway to practice. Happy to take questions. And if any of you are interested, University of Maryland now has a scholarship in Dr. Meixner's memory that his family set up. If you've got the means and interest, that link will take you to a place where you can donate to add to that. It supports students in AGNR. Thanks for your attention.
Tom Meixner was a soil educator.
Dave.
So you offered a lot of really interesting tools and perspectives. I was going to go back to the mind map.
Yep.
Exercise. I think, like, from an innovation standpoint, what's interesting to do with something like that is to not only look at the direct effects and the direct relationships and connections that people can identify, but to go out that next layer and start looking at the indirect connections. I don't know if your team kind of explore that as like a solution space for novelty, you know, maybe policy or actually stuff on the ground.
Yeah, that was, I've seen people use that in spaces, and we didn't track how they were building models in real time. And I think that would be one of the things you would have to do, is to understand sort of what they think is at the core and as how it expands out and has more of a diffuse effect. We can look at that after the fact and ask people questions about that. But I think that's one of the tools that this lets you do, is sort of think about, it lets us represent their knowledge, but it also lets us think about how they build things up and what they prioritize in a way.
It would be like hidden solutions, obviously.
Right.
Trevor knows, you got the data, maybe there's.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that the software also lets you do is sort of treat each of those things in the cloud as a solution and basically jack it up to 100% and just see what happens to the rest of the network. It's very like a qualitative mapping exercise that lets you get at that. Yeah. Oh.
Which you kind of indicated that when you implement the green infrastructure that can be associated with
Mm-hmm.
were you able to quantify that, or see people kind of came to work on it and we did some message change? Did the project were able to quantify the associated with?
We haven't quantified things as a social benefit other than mapping and measuring things like changes in urban heat island over space. We haven't gone in to ask sort of direct questions of people or think about changes in economic kind of values of things, but qualitatively we've done some on that. Ed?
Seems like there's some parallels, I mean, with like Baltimore, and I forget some of the talks, maybe there's things that you did, but we had the person come to talk about the infrastructure and how some of the underrepresented groups are, they may not accept some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody said, you know, well, we don't want that because it'll make property values go up and we'll get kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you work with people that may not be familiar with it or ecosystem services, and how does that work? You know, I mean, the government can come in and say things, but what about the people that are there, and I don't know, education or community interaction?
Yeah, that's a huge part of trying to understand how this plays out. And I think Tucson's a good example of one way to try to do that, which is really comes from a ground up approach. It starts with individuals who are interested and neighborhoods that become interested in things rather than the city coming in and saying, this is how we're going to do it. Part of that, I think, and it would be an interesting research question, thinking about Baltimore versus Tucson. We have to manage water bodies here because of EPA regulations and TMDLs. They don't have to do that there. They're doing this purely as a water harvesting idea. So a lot of those fears aren't necessarily there. There's other things that they worry about, but the property value side of it's not necessarily that. So it is through education. It is through things like working with planning programs and rebates to try to make this more cost effective for different neighborhoods. But it's a different way of doing it than sort of like that centralized command and control approach.
It would be an interesting comparison, just the regulatory structure, due to the amount of water that's in the ecosystem, how that can just big background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people have seen when you bin cities out in a different way, whether they have like combined sewer storm systems or not, they have very different policy environments for stormwater regulation. So it does, those differences physically play out into the policy world as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in Baltimore, we've really struggled with the education, especially in lower stormwater just doesn't really register as an environment.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that in Tucson with maybe relative with water harvesting just isn't on the area?
Yeah, definitely. It's partly like the connection between renters versus owners. It's a lot of the same barriers in terms of like time, there's language barriers, all of that. So a lot of the policies and programs that are going in place to try to alleviate that, deal with that. So it's bilingual engagement, it's hitting kids at school, lots of things like that.
And University of Arizona is not a
It is a land grant. Yeah, it's also a Hispanic serving institution now. So
I'm sure there's more questions people want to ask, but we're going to pull it to a close here so we can be good citizens, and the class is coming in behind us. So let's thank Dr. Pavao-Zuckerman one more time.
thank you.